Love, philosophical, theological, psychological perspectives. Week 4, LoveSession4Haughton, a very insightful thinker on love, and her classic book on love is worthy of study. I've summarized it in the text, various perspectives, but I hope this will incite you to follow it up at some point to study her book in more depth. One of the things that's really important in her analysis is how she investigates the relationship between the neglect and inability to receive love in a younger period of development, and how that can be affected as one grows older. And one of the things she does is offer us hope, because she'll give us examples of how those who have experienced blocks in development have not necessarily failed at love in the future. There is a tendency to neglect or to dismiss Christianity as having a negative notion of sexuality. And she says that in the essence of its teaching, that's just not the case. You go back to Paul's use of the term sarx, which is literally means flesh, but he used it to mean anything that's death-producing. It wasn't the same as the term for body, such as soma. And this led to a misinterpretation of Paul, where people thought that he was denigrating the body and likewise sexuality. And that's just not the case for Haughton. She doesn't think that's enough to really put the blame on Christianity. Now, we also do have a phenomenon following Puritanism, and even to some extent Kierkegaard, to fail to differentiate or to reduce religion to ethics. Now, I'm not saying that Kierkegaard was doing that, but when he separated religion and ethics, it created the condition for people to reduce religion to ethics. But that really comes out more of a Puritan context as it grew up in the Americas. But that's not the case with Christianity in Haughton's. That's a misreading of Paul to the extent that people denigrate the body. Christianity is based on the incarnation of God into a human being, and therefore it would be God embracing everything that's genuinely human. She has 2 chapters on sexuality. One sees it as a negative thing. The other one sees it more positive. But before I get to that, I just want to mention her reference to Shakespeare. Shakespeare is a turning point because Shakespeare allows us in the Renaissance to move from the medieval notion of love, which was often a courtly love ideal, where people often did not commune with the fruits or the object of their love. And so she sees the Shakespeare turning that from a medieval notion to a more modern notion where you do have romantic love in the context of a marriage. I won't go over the negative aspects of sexuality that she refers to, but I will say, I will mention here the 4 more positive approaches to sexuality. The fact that we need it to procreate makes it pragmatic. The species needs to reproduce. There is a sacralization of sexuality, and although she doesn't go into this, I would say this is probably in the Catholic context, the religious mysticism that grounds genuine religious life. But also when we get to Soloviev you'll see that he suggests that spousal love is sacral in the sense that they're portals of the divine to one another. There's also an exploitative, and I put escapist in parentheses because I think that's more descriptive, although there is an exploitative aspect to what she talks about in the exploitative, that you're basically just using sex to escape. Now, when she says positive, she doesn't mean that this is necessarily what people ought to be doing. She's just saying that their attitudes tend to say, well, this is one good thing about it, that people can have this escape. And if you think about economic classes, and she goes into that to some extent, where people are working really hard and they don't have a lot of money or context, basically they don't have a lot of freedom. This is one area where they can experience freedom. But she also goes into how the gentry class exploited the lower classes by using sexuality as a form of escape. And then finally, there's the romantic notion, which is kind of, I like to think of C.S. Lewis's distinction between Venus and Eros, that the two go together in order to occasion the opportunity to commune at an intimate level with body, mind, and spirit. She then moves on to some literary examples where she's exploring now more the notion of love. She's moved away from her couple of chapters on sexuality, and she's picking up this theme again about the early influence of neglect on one's emotional development of love and experience of love, and how that plays out. In the case of Little Lord Fauntleroy, he had a very close bond with his mother, but when he finds out that he's royalty and he goes to England to assume that royalty, he doesn't take his mother with him. I always wondered, why not? I mean, he's the Little Lord Fauntleroy, but anyway, he's overseas and he's still attached like a compass to his mother. And what that does for Haughton is really highlight that importance of that mother-child bond, and how if that's not negotiated in a healthy way, or if that's disrupted, it can affect one's ability to prosper in life. The other example he uses is Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. David Copperfield had a relationship with a woman, Dora. It failed and was quite discouraging. And then he does eventually get into another more successful marriage with Agnes. And what that shows Haughton is how resilient love actually is, that if we fail at love, we can get a second chance. And maybe we ought to just look at our failed relationships and see, well, what can we do different next time? The National Velvet is the story about Velvet, who has a very successful mother. So they have a complex relationship. But she goes on to win the national title with this horse. Later it was made in the movie with Mickey Rooney, who you see pictured there. This is significant because the role of the mother on Velvet and inspiring her to do this, and how, it wasn't a directly touchy-feely relationship between them, but they complemented each other quite well. And she zeroes in on that example at the end of the race, and Velvet is exhausted. Her mother comes in and is consoling her, and again showing how this relationship within a family can be mutual and complementary, inspiring one to be one's best. Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons gets to the Victorian context where the protagonist doesn't really have a good relationship with his father. It's estranged. And towards the end of his life, he's able to forgive his father. So there's a shift occurring at this time for Haughton, that the social structures that once grounded the nuclear family are changing, and now what's going to ground the nuclear family, at least probably until recently, is love. And again, she's writing in the 1960s, so we could wonder what grounds the relationship with the nuclear family now, if that still happens. But the power and the influence of fathers and sons on each other, and the importance of forgiveness. We'll come back to this topic when we review Desmond Tutu's book on forgiveness. She reviews 2 books by Charlotte Bronte, and what you see here, the important thing here is that the protagonist doesn't experience love. She's orphaned, and then a mentor at the boarding school is able to really fill that gap. And I know there's been terrible experiences that people have had at boarding schools, but this is one where it works. And again, what Haughton is focusing on is the resilience of love, and that if you don't get it in childhood, you can still get healed through mentorship. And of course, mentorship is very important in Rudyard Kipling's book Kim, where a young boy is inspired by a yogi and his mentor, and learns to love and take care of him. And they both benefit from that relationship. Focusing on turning her attention to communities, she focuses on what makes a genuine community, and that for her is a common purpose and taking action upon that common purpose. And the example she uses is the Rising Hill Comprehensive School of 1960-1965. And in this, this was a hopeful sign where a inner city school full of gangs and violence and peer rivalry is taken over in an experiment where the principal isn't going to have many rigid rules. He's going to try to mediate between the conflicts rather than having them duking it out. And he's going to get the teachers to get more invested in them. They start to feel valued, and there's this successful program taking up, and these kids really start to prosper in this new context because they're trusted and they're loved. Now, in the beginning, he says they test him a lot, but until they start to trust the system. And anyone that's taught high school knows that teenagers, when you're new to their classroom, they will test you. But eventually, it becomes a successful experiment. But what happens is the local community doesn't trust it, and the institution, the educational institution in London, can't support it, and that brings it down to a collapse. So what this shows Haughton is that there's a resilience to love, and that it can heal, it can build up a community, but at the same time, it's a threat to the greater context, and so it needs the support. So that's why I titled this chapter Resilient Power, thinking of the Rising Hill Comprehensive School. The final chapter, she deals with the love of country and the love of God, and pulls out different examples. Now, she also talks about anti-love, and anti-love occurs when you make the object of your love the sole goal instead of the well-being. So we saw the devastation in the early part of the 20th century with the religification of the state that occurred in various fascist contexts during that time. There are great figures like Anne Frank whose stories and example surpass that devastation. She also mentions Franz Jägerstätter, who don't put the country ahead of genuine value, ethics, and religious value. Thomas Merton reminds us that the theology of love must seek to deal realistically with evil and injustice in the world and not merely compromise with them. So love is also about justice. It includes justice. It's not about being nice and getting along. And it challenges the status quo. That's what Haughton also provides for us. So real love is not only the desire for the other or beyond in human life and experience, it is the impulse to give oneself to that otherness, as opposed to anti-love. And she says anti-love is the nearest thing to the devil. Mystics, she says, can see this clearly. And we would think the Spanish mystics who were trained in discernment could possibly be a resource. I'm thinking Teresa of Avila and Ignatius Loyola. So, she has frankly, anecdotally, powerfully given us some insights into love and its resilient power. And that we thank you, Rosemary Haughton.